Let me spend a couple of minutes talking about Joe Brady. Yesterday, the news broke that Brady was taking the Carolina Panthers job. My feeling all along with Joe Brady, as I said, all season was LSU was not going to lose Joe Brady to another college assistant job. They were prepared to offer him money, title, whatever they needed to keep him in place from making a lateral move. In 2014, LSU lost John Chavis to Texas A&M for what was a lateral move, for a lot of reasons that were included. If you remember, he had the miles clause in his contract, which was something that Joe Oliva did that really ticked off John Chavis. He didn't want his contract and his money tied to Les Miles. And ultimately, LSU lost John Chavis to A&M. This wasn't going to happen with Joe Brady. My feeling was, though, LSU could have lost Brady to one of two things that it couldn't offer, an NFL job or a college head coaching job. And Mississippi State reportedly kicked the tires on Joe Brady, and clearly the NFL came calling. So LSU couldn't match that. Okay. So I think there are two very distinct points and parts to this that I want to make. Number one is that you have to clearly give Joe Brady his just due for what happened this year. Sometimes, like in recruiting, right, we tend to do this. If a kid signs with your school, he's going to go to the Hall of Fame. If a kid picks another school, well, he stinks and he's overrated and he's never going to pan out. I mean, that's the default that so many people go into in recruiting. And there might be a tendency to feel the same way here. But I think the two are not mutually exclusive. Number one, I think Joe Brady deserves a lot of credit. And number two, I think LSU is going to be just fine without Joe Brady. To be clear, if Joe Brady had never shown up at LSU, they would not have had the season they just had. LSU wanted to go to spread. They needed someone that was an outside-the-box thinker that could inject some of these types of concepts into the LSU offense. They were impressed with Joe Brady when they met with him with the New Orleans Saints the year prior. They filed it away, remembered him, interviewed him, liked him. He came in, and he brought some revolutionary concepts from the New Orleans Saints. And maybe more importantly, he put ego aside and meshed perfectly with Steve Ensminger. The fact that those two were egoless and got along fluidly speaks to why the season went as well as it did. That's one. And that can exist plainly, where forever and ever, as long as we look back at this season, we realize that all the other pieces, Ed Ogeron and Steve Ensminger and Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and Terrace Marshall and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, they were all in place in 2018 and didn't sniff the production that they unlocked in 2019 with Joe Brady on staff. That's one. Okay. Now that needs to exist and live and breathe there on its own. The other part of this is that LSU is going to be just fine without Joe Brady. I have oftentimes shared with you what I call my native language theory. One of the reasons, in my opinion, that you're seeing so many 30-somethings elevate rapidly in coaching ranks offensively is because guys like Joe Brady, who's 30 years old, his entire football life has been in the 7-on-7 culture. All he knows is 7-on-7, spread concepts, RPOs. That's been his whole football life. That is his native language. You can take an older football coach and teach them these things, and they can do it, but they're never going to do it as well as someone who's only known that and grew up in that. Like me. You could take me or you and you could teach me Spanish, and I could speak Spanish fluently. But I'm never going to speak it as well as I speak English, my native language. I'll never speak it as fluently as someone who it is their native language. Similar with offense right now. It's why you're seeing guys like Sean McVay elevate with the Rams the way he did, and Cliff Kingsbury, why he got a head coaching job in the NFL, and why you see guys like Kellen Moore in their 20s get an offensive coordinator job in the NFL. It's their native language. They understand this better than older coaches in football. Now, eventually, that will revert to the mean. But for now, in this moment in time in football, these types of coaches that have this knowledge are at a premium. The other thing that's very important to note, so my point with that is you can find another one. You can find another guy that understands spread concepts that can come in and work with all the talent that LSU has and with Steve Ensminger and the coaches on staff. The other thing that is important to note is that Joe Brady was not the quarterback's coach. Joe Brady is a former receiver who on this staff worked more so with receivers. It was Steve Ensminger and George Munoz that worked with quarterbacks. Steve Ensminger is LSU's quarterbacks coach as well as offensive coordinator. And George Munoz is an analyst who worked a lot with Joe Burrow. If you go back to the Heisman presentation, and you remember when Burrow got the award and he went and hugged everybody before he went up and gave a speech. Well, there was Ed Ogeron, and there was Steve Ensminger, and there was Joe Brady, and then there was a tall man with dark hair that many people didn't know who he was. That was George Munoz. If you go watch games on the sideline, George Munoz is always right behind Ed Ogeron with headsets on. A lot of people on the sideline will tell you when Joe Burrow would come to the sideline, of course he'd get on the phone and talk to Ensminger and Brady up in the booth, but the only guy on the sideline he would talk to during the game is Munoz. Had a great affinity for him. Like last week, George Munoz interviewed for the Oregon offensive coordinator job. People who know he's a very well-respected guy. And my guess is that's a very natural elevation that you take Munoz and put him in Brady's role. He knows the offense. He's worked with the players. He knows the personnel. He knows Steve. He's been in the meeting rooms. That seems like a very natural transition that's there for LSU. And you have a guy that's worked with Miles Brennan and worked with the other quarterbacks and knows the personnel. I personally would have loved to have seen Joe Brady next year without Joe Burrow, to see just how much his influence mattered and how much of it was Joe Burrow having a transcendent year. I think a big part of Joe Burrow's opportunity to have the type of season he did is because of the concepts Joe Brady brought. But I also know that a bigger part of the reason why Joe Burrow had the season he did is because he elevated his game to a point where he is a pro playing against college defenses, something we've talked about a lot. When you think about, I mentioned this yesterday, there was a pass in the third quarter. LSU was moving left to right, and Thad Moss, Burrow threw a 7-yard out completion of Thad Moss on the left sideline, right in front of the LSU bench. It was well covered. The defender was on Thad's hip with full extension, and Burrow put it over the defender's hand on Moss's outside shoulder where only he could get it, and it's a 7-yard gain. No one's going to talk about that play, but that's a Sunday throw that when you put on the film, scouts are going to go, oh. And that's the difference from Burrow a year ago to Burrow today, the biggest difference. And that's what we will see, I think, is the biggest difference between Burrow this year and whatever it is that Miles Brennan does next year. It's not to say Miles can't be great, or whoever the quarterback is can't be great, but to anticipate or expect anyone to throw for 5,500 yards and 60 touchdowns is absurd because literally nobody's ever done it. Ever. I would have loved to have seen Brady with whoever was next for LSU, but I also understand you strike while the iron is hot. What if, without Burrow, LSU's offense regresses to a point where people say, you see, it's not Boy Wonder, it was Burrow. And if you're Brady and you want to get back to the NFL, and a lot of coaches favor the NFL because they don't have to recruit, and while this was Brady's first full-time job in college football, he didn't have the reputation yet as a super dynamic recruiter, someone who just loved that in the way that Ed Ogeron does or Frank Wilson does. So maybe this was the inevitability, and he decided to take it while he could, while he had an enormous offer in hand at 30 years old, and you can't fault him for it. So yes, salute Joe Brady. Appreciate the year he gave LSU because he was a massive part of what is the greatest season in the history of LSU football and what some are debating is the greatest season in the history of college football. But let's also understand that LSU is going to be just fine without Joe Brady next year.